The first thing Victor noticed was the shadow. Not the shape, not the wrongness yet, just the shadow, in the third row of aisle 9, falling at an angle that the overhead fluorescence couldn't account for. As if something was standing in that row in a way that redirected the light. He stopped walking. He shone his flashlight down the row. Empty shelving, evidence boxes, sealed plastic, dust on the concrete floor. He stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the climate control units, the low mechanical breathing of the building around him, and then he wrote in his log, 2:47 a.m., aisle 9, rows 3 through 11, checked and clear. He did not flag the shadow. In 11 years of overnight work at the Harwick County Evidence Facility, he had learned that the south wall fluorescence played tricks, and that most of what seemed strange in this building had an explanation if he was patient enough to find it. He believed that for 6 more days. The Harwick County Evidence Facility was not a dramatic place. It sat on the northern edge of the county services campus, a low concrete structure behind a chain-link fence, surrounded by a parking lot that was almost always empty by the time Victor arrived at 10 each night. Inside, 42,000 square feet of climate-controlled shelving. Evidence boxes tagged, catalogued, sealed in clear plastic. Biological samples in freezer units along the south wall. Chain of custody documentation for every piece of physical evidence from every open and closed case in the county going back 30 years. Victor's job was to leave it alone correctly. He walked rounds every 2 hours, logged his checks, monitored environmental systems, and verified seal integrity on the biological storage units. He had done this for 11 years. He knew every shelf. He knew the sounds the building made when it was empty. 3 weeks ago, he had noticed a discrepancy in his movement log, a 20-minute gap between his check of the biological freezers and his arrival at the south exit checkpoint. He remembered nothing specific about those 20 minutes. He assumed he had forgotten to log a secondary check, initialed the gap, and moved on. He did not think about it again until the footage. What prompted him to pull the camera archive at all was something small. On his third round of the previous Tuesday, he had walked the length of aisle 14, logged it as checked, and reached the north end of the row. When he turned and looked back down the aisle, he had the distinct and unreasonable feeling that something had passed through behind him. Not a sound, not a glimpse, just a feeling. The kind that came from 11 years of knowing exactly what the building felt like when it was empty. He walked the aisle again, empty. He checked the overnight cameras covering the aisle entrance. The footage showed him walking through cleanly. Nothing followed. He scrubbed back 10 minutes and watched the empty row. 40 seconds in, a single frame corrupted, just a flash of static. And then the feed was clear again. He told himself it was a compression artifact. He almost believed it. What he could not explain away was the photographs. Every month, Victor conducted a seal integrity check on the long-term cold evidence units along the east wall, photographing each numbered unit's seal documentation in sequence. He had done this the previous Thursday, walking the east wall alone at 3 a.m. When he transferred the images to the log terminal, he found 43 photographs instead of 40. The 3 extra images showed Unit 31, Unit 32, and Unit 33, units he had photographed. But the angles were wrong, lower. as if taken by someone crouching or by someone shorter than Victor. The images were slightly blurred in a way his were not. The seals in the photographs were correctly documented. Nothing was disturbed. He stood at the terminal for a long time. Someone else had photographed those units that night. Victor pulled 12 months of camera archive footage. What he found took most of the following night to map, because it was subtle. On most nights, at various points throughout his shift, there was a second set of rounds. The figure moved through sections he had already checked, or through sections he had not yet reached, timing itself against his rotation. When their routes threatened to overlap, it used the service corridors between the main shelving sections, paths that stayed away from the overhead cameras. On the high-resolution feeds covering the biological freezer section, Victor found the earliest recorder he could locate, 11 months ago. A figure barely visible at the edge of the camera's range, standing against the wall in the corridor between freezer bank C and the chain of custody room, standing perfectly still for 43 minutes. He switched dates. Over the following months, the figure moved with less caution. It began covering sections with more confidence. By spring, it was running a full rotation. 4 months ago, it was doing his rounds exactly, not similar rounds. His rounds, same sequence, same timing. It paused at the same units he paused at. When it reached the end of a row, it stood for the same number of seconds before turning. Victor froze the clearest frame he could find and stared at it. His height, his build, his uniform, and a slight favoring of the left foot, a compensation he'd developed after a knee injury 2 years ago, something he had never once consciously thought about since. He heard something then, from somewhere in the South Isles, a dry, brief sound, like something compressing, like a joint or cartilage under pressure. Interior, brief. He sat very still and waited, and the building returned to its normal hum, and he turned back to the screen. There was one frame in the archive where the figure had turned its head, caught at the edge of a ceiling camera. Poor angle. But the rotation was wrong, too far. 15 degrees past the range a human neck allowed. And in that single frame, just barely, he could see the face. It looked exactly like his. Victor called his facility supervisor. He called the county non-emergency line. He sat at the terminal with his phone in his hand and waited. And because 11 years of procedure were harder to override than fear, he stood and began his rounds. He did not let himself run. He walked the way he always walked, same aisles, same sequence, one hand on his flashlight and one on the radio, which had no signal in this section of the building. He was halfway through his second aisle when he heard it again, from the direction of aisle 9. Not a footstep, not the shelving contracting in the cold. A dry interior sound, the sound of something compressing that was not built to compress that way. And this time, it came 3 times, evenly spaced, like joints being moved through a careful range of motion. Then silence. Victor turned toward aisle 9. His flashlight beam reached the entrance to the row and stopped at the dark beyond the first bank of shelves. At the far end of the aisle, approximately 30 meters away, a figure stood with its back to him. His height, his build, his uniform, his slight left lean. As Victor watched, the figure turned to face him. The movement was slow, unhurried. The head rotated past 90 degrees, past the point where a human neck stopped, until the face came fully into view. and the sound it made was the same dry interior sound he had heard from the south aisles, compressing and deliberate, echoing off the concrete floor. The face was his. The figure held his gaze for a moment. Then it raised its left hand, the one with the small scar along the knuckle, from a filing cabinet 7 years ago, and it began walking his rounds. Victor's shift log for that night ends at 3:12 a.m. with a completed entry for aisle 7, rows 1 through 9. The facility supervisor arrived at 6:15 a.m. She found the building locked, climate systems normal, all biological seals intact. Victor's car was still in the parking lot. The overnight camera footage showed Victor completing his full 4-round rotation without incident. When investigators pulled the archive footage from the previous 11 months, they found 2 overlapping sets of rounds, going back further than any camera in the building could confirm. Both sets of movement logs were identical. Both were signed by Victor Kane's